Hi everybody, today we're working on a 2003 Mini Cooper S. This one blew its engine. It was making some knocking sounds. It actually sounded a lot like a timing chain rattle. And as the owner was troubleshooting it, the engine let loose and threw a connecting rod on the first cylinder. So we're going to be replacing the motor on this car and doing a few other things while we have it taken apart. We'll be also working on the suspension. This is what the engine sounded like before it blew up. To me, this sounds just like a bad timing chain tensioner, and that's actually what we thought was wrong with the car until we took it apart. So we think that the top end of the motor is probably good. The car has about 85,000 miles. We'll be changing the valve stems and lapping the valves a little bit, but it looks like the damage is just in the bottom end. So we got this short block. This is a BMW Mini remanufactured engine, brand new internals, and a remanufactured block. So we're going to go ahead and swap all the parts over to this one. And if it turns out, after we take everything apart, if it looks like the head needs work too, well, we'll just have to deal with that as well. I don't know if we have to remove the subframe to get the engine out. I don't think it's necessary, because we're going to take the transmission and the engine out together as a pair. But might as well. It'll only take just a little bit extra time, and it'll free up some space inside as well to make it easier to disconnect the various parts we need to disconnect. So we're going to go ahead and replace all the front end suspension parts as well. So that's the inner and the outer ball joints, and the control arm bushings. This owner doesn't want to go for a super stiff ride. He wants a stock feel, so we're putting rubber bushings in instead of the polyurethane ones. So I already had the front of the car taken apart. To diagnose, we thought it might have been a supercharger issue based on some ticking sounds we heard from the supercharger when we did an oil service on it a few weeks ago. But it looks like actually the damage was from behind the supercharger on the block. We'll get this car up on the jack stands and start digging in there. And up to this point, this is basically just a front end service on the car. So you can see my other video for how to put the car into front end service mode. Alright, so I got the car up on jack stands, and I guess we'll start peeling off the front of the engine to start with. Before doing any of that, we're going to want to disconnect the battery to prevent any sparks when we disconnect the starter or the alternator. Wow, this Mini still has its original battery. Not bad for 85,000 miles. And remember, this the back hatch here is electrically activated, so don't close it all the way or you won't be able to open it again, especially if you have a bunch of stuff in the back seat that prevents you from getting access to the emergency wire. If you do happen to close the back hatch by accident, the emergency wire is right here underneath the back seat. There's a couple of clips you just pull up slightly on the back, and then pull this wire, and the hatch will open right up. When I turn the bolt here, the wire is trying to rotate with it, so I'm going to just hold it with a pair of channel lock pliers. Remember, we got the battery disconnected. There it goes. We'll get this air conditioning compressor off. There's two bolts here, and then there's one long bolt along the bottom. And we'll let that hang down. We can see the hole in the engine now. It looks like the connecting rod separated from the bottom of the piston and went out the side of the block. The bottom half of the piston, where the wrist pin goes through the holes on the piston, are torn in half, and the piston is stuck in there. It's actually at a bit of an angle. There's water in the oil as well, so either the piston or the connecting rod actually broke through the water jacket. Next, we'll finish removing the supercharger. Yeah, I've got another video you can watch, and I show you how to get to the supercharger. But basically, front end service mode, and then get the radiator out of the way. Remove the alternator, or just let it hang down. Those three 13mm bolts here, 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 here. That's 4 actually, and then there's a 16mm attaching to the tensioner arm here. Pull back the intake assembly here. I find it's easiest to remove the horn from the intake manifold rather than breaking apart this little bypass hose here. There's a heater hose going into the water pump as well. Once you do that, you should be able to just pull it off. There it goes. We'll go ahead and get this intake manifold out of the way now. We'll go ahead and disconnect these hose clips here. Pull back on the red clip and then pull the tube out. Okay. So for the fuel line, real simple. I'll just put a rag here to catch it. If there's any fuel pressure, you pull this back, push the hose forward, pull back on the clip, slide it out, and you might get about, I don't know, a quarter cup of gasoline coming out of here. This car's been sitting for about a week, so the pressure was mostly gone. I'll just put that there so anything that drains out will get caught by the rag. Next, we'll disconnect the fuel injector wires. Just a metal clip on the back, just pop it. You just need to pop it just a little bit. And then push it back on so it doesn't disappear on you. You don't really need to remember what order they're in. When you line the wiring back up, it'll go right back in place. Might as well disconnect the coil pack wiring as well. The last wire along the front is the camshaft position sensor. We'll remove the engine support bracket here to be able to disconnect it. This wire is just like the coil pack. There's a little clip, red clip that you need to slide, and then you squeeze and pull up. Okay, so that's that. So that comes off. This is the brake booster line. I'll just put this out of the way. This goes to the O2 sensor. This goes to the mass airflow sensor. There's another one that goes to the front airflow sensor. And then we've got our NOx sensor wire as well. And we got our crank position sensor down here. Same type of clip. push up on the red lock, squeeze, and pull off. Pry these out. And that's the vast majority of the engine wiring. Got one clip here for the thermostat, temperature sensor. We'll get this heater core hose off. Okay. I call this the octopus. This octopus wiring harness is fastened behind the throttle body bracket, so we need to remove the bracket. There's a clip here, just kind of push back on it and pull up. That's kind of out of the way. You can see there's a couple wires going to the back side of the motor. We'll deal with that later. Okay, under here we got one more heater hose. Next, we'll go ahead and get the clutch slave cylinder off. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and replace the clutch while we're doing this, obviously. But we're going to do it off the car, so it should be super duper easy. I think this is probably going to be in the way, so just disconnect all this stuff. Okay, it's all out of the way. I need to remove this, loosen this fuse box, because later on we're probably going to take this motor mount out of here. Okay, so it's been about an hour, other than putting the car into front end service mode, which was probably an additional half hour. We've got all the wiring off the front of the motor. So next we'll probably go ahead and take the subframe out and start working on the back side of the motor. Well, we'll see. Maybe I can just get the control arms and leave the subframe in, but I have a feeling it'll be easier just to have the subframe out of the way. Make it really easy to get in there and get the axle and the starter motor and all that stuff out. I mean, to take the whole subframe out, it's only just a few extra bolts. I mean, if I'm going to do the suspension anyway, the only extra bolts are the sway bar, the power steering reservoir, then you do the headlight leveling sensor as well. Well, that's pretty much it, really. I mean, all the other stuff's got to come out anyway. You're already going to take the axles out, and you're going to have to disconnect the wires to the starter motor anyway. Be careful removing the headlight leveling sensor wire. It's easily broken and it tends to be really sticky. So study it carefully, put some silicone spray on it if you need to, and just careful. Swing a hammer to break the steering tie rod ends. Usually 3 hits does it. A couple 13mm bolts under here. And if we're lucky, good hammer swing and that'll come right out. There we go. Now we'll go ahead and disconnect the shift cables, but before doing that I'll see if we can get in there and remove the steering knuckle. That worked pretty good. Had to make this ridiculously long contraption here, but that was a lot faster than doing it from underneath. Get these shift brackets off here. There you go, that's one. There you go. Cables out. What I like to do is use a screwdriver just to push these so that they're not hung up. A couple of screwdrivers and then a third one from underneath. That seems to work really good. There's probably some kind of special tool for that, but 3 screwdrivers work just as well. Oh, let's get the backup sensor before we forget. Here's the backup sensor right here. The clip is on the back side, unfortunately, so got to pull it off a little bit from behind. Now we'll go ahead and get this reservoir out of the way. Alright, I think we're all set to get the subframe out. Okay, everything's been removed. We got all the bolts out. We've got the outer ball joint disconnected. We've got the steering ball joints removed. The sway bar end links have been removed. The wiring connector up here has been removed. Power steering fan's out. The upper power steering reservoir has been loosened up, ready to come out. We got the headlight leveling sensor on the other side disconnected, and the steering knuckle. So we can just go ahead and start lowering it. And we'll lower about 4 inches or so. Then we'll stop for a second because there's still some wiring attached to the power steering pump. On the power steering pump there's the control line here. Just push the clip and it'll pull right out. And then the big 100 amp connector in the back here, there's actually no clip at all. You just kind of pull it and it comes right out. And then the whole thing is held onto the pump itself by these little wiring connectors, so just pry that up and out. And that should be the last bits that are holding the subframe onto the car. So we'll just pull the power steering reservoir down and out. Alright, now it's down all the way. I folded the power steering reservoir over a little bit and it comes right out. You want to keep this vertical as much as you can, otherwise it'll tend to leak fluid out the cap. So I like to stick a piece of wood in here to kind of reinforce it. Later on we'll go ahead and do the suspension work. Okay, so we got the subframe out now. Next we'll drain oil from the engine and the transmission and pull the axles out and disconnect the wiring running along the back side of the engine. On the 6-speed there's a 8mm hex plug on the bottom. It's in there pretty tight, so I like to crack it free with a hammer. And this transmission holds, I believe it's 1.7 liters. You can use the stock MTF 94. I like to use Redline MTL. And next is engine oil. That looks like it's mixed in with water. Looks like probably the water jacket was broken. So our engine oil is mixed together with water. That's considerably more liquid coming out of this than should normally be in a mini crankcase. So we've got probably the 4.5 liters of oil and at least 1 or 2 liters worth of water coming out here. Alright, we got the oil out. And we'll finish removing these last bits here. Need to disconnect the oil sensor. We're going to have to take off this heat shield. There's a 10mm bolt holding this heat shield in, and I need to take all that off to get this last remaining wiring out of the way. And then I'll have to make a decision about, do I want to disconnect the intake manifold here, or disconnect it at the back here and then just run the whole engine out together with the manifold. I think I'll probably do that. It looks like easier, just a couple bolts here. So there's a couple of 13mm bolts here holding this heat shield in place. And there's one 10mm bolt right there. To bend it a little bit to get it out. We'll flex it in any case. Okay, it looks like this little wire here, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a 10mm nut above the two 13mm nuts here. If I remove that, that should be what looks like the last wiring harness connection. These are the wiring for the starter solenoid. The ones you want to disconnect when you're disconnecting the wiring harness is this top 13mm. Leave the bottom 13mm intact, but behind that there's a really small wire going up into this 10mm bolt, which is a little bit hard to see when it's on the car, but that's where the wiring harness is going, is to here and here. Looks like this last wiring harness is connected to a bracket, which is behind the top 15mm bolt for the starter motor. Now we'll disconnect this heat exchange heater hoses. It's hard to see because the camera is pointing a bit too high. Well, what I'm doing here is disconnecting the water lines from the oil heat exchange. Be careful, as it's soft aluminum. So I believe the only thing now holding the engine in before we can start bringing the cherry picker over and disconnecting the engine mounts is going to be these axles. So I'll remove the axles. Alright, the right side axle is held in by this carrier bearing. It's just three 13mm nuts. Three 13mm bolts. They're not on there very tight at all. Once you've removed these three 13mm bolts, it'll just come right out, just with a little bit of force. Go ahead and rotate it around. Park it up out of the way. I'll put a bungee cord around it. Just up out of the way. And next is the left side axle. Just pry and it pops out. We'll bungee this one up out of the way as well. Okay, so last thing is to remove the exhaust. And like I said, what I'll probably do, less number of bolts, I'll just disconnect it from the back end here. And we'll need to remove this O2 sensor connector as well. The connection is right here. You have to remove this 10mm brackets here to fish the wire out. Looks like the nut is a 15 and the bolt is a 17. That actually came off surprisingly easy. Okay, I think that's everything other than engine mounts. So the engine is now just hanging by the two front, the passenger and the driver's side mounts here. Looks like it's time to come up with some, get the cherry picker out here and figure out how to pick this thing on out of here. Looks like the wiring harness is completely free now. Okay, I think that'll be good enough to get the wiring harness out of the way. If you're not good at remembering which wire goes where, might be a good idea to make some notes. Okay, up to this point, I've been working about 3 hours, I think, and I've got everything completely disconnected, including the electrical, cable, and water lines. I don't have the fancy brackets, so I'm going to have to make something up. I might just use some bolts and a piece of metal and run a chain around it. So I'll get started on that. Alright, so I've made a couple of brackets out of, I guess this is 1/8 inch steel. I think this is plenty strong to get this out of here. I'll put one here, but first we'll support the transmission from underneath and we'll remove this mount. Okay, so we got the transmission supported by a floor jack, so now I can take this transmission mount off. Lower it a little bit. And I'm not sure if we need to do this, but the instruction book says to do so. So we'll take this mount out of the way. I suppose this could get in the way when we're lifting the transmission out. Alright, so now we'll put my handmade engine brackets on. See if we can get this chain in place. I actually discovered that the engine is better balanced if we put the bracket on the back bolts for the transmission, not the front ones. All right, just lift it on out of there. Yeah, there it is. Now I'll take off the exhaust manifold. We'll get the transmission off, and this is going to be super easy compared to doing it in the car, obviously. Okay, so we got the engine out. I got the transmission separated from the old engine. Took off the exhaust manifold. As you can see, we've got a Mini Cooper here with no engine in it. Probably only weighs about 1,500 pounds at this point, and no subframe. I think we'll make this part one of the video for this engine replacement job, and then we'll continue in part two with taking off all the old parts off of the old engine. We'll replace the clutch and the flywheel, and transferring everything onto the new engine. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned and come back for part two when we start doing all that stuff.